What did they have before electricity? What did they have before candlelight in South Africa? Electricity. Right. That's what they have.
You want a sicha?
That just means he wasn't in class for 2 days.
1 day.
No, I gave these out 2 days ago.
I was here on Sunday.
Okay, so why didn't you give them these? Because I gave them out on Sunday.
Amen.
Okay. Talked a lot about minhag hamokim. Right. So let's see where we got to. Okay, Gimel, basically. We got past that, no? Look. There was a short paragraph that I wanted to read. Okay, we'll start in Gimel. Doesn't make sense, but whatever. Oh, there we are. I'm sorry. We're up there. We didn't make it to Gimel yet. All right. Ubezeh Gufa on page 400, this left paragraph. Ubezeh Gufa. Let's start moving a little. We're going to slowly through this sikha here. Ubezeh Gufa, and this itself. Ba'avayda b'chol makom u'ba'ilam. We learned yesterday each place has its own characteristic, and the reason the Yidden are found there is to elevate whatever positive reality exists in that place. And that's the idea of tzedakah, also Kadosh Baruch Hu Yisrael, shepizun beina umayis. The Eibishter did an act of righteousness with us, that he scattered us amongst all the people. So we can elevate all the positive things that exist in different places. Right? So Jews can get polite because they hung out in America for a while, in South Africa, and these places where people are polite. There's two different realities and two different levels. Aleph, the inner action with the lower realms. What does that mean? That a person causes holiness to penetrate even in a lowly place, meaning all these places all over the world. Lefi gidrei amakim, in accordance with the particular reality in that place. But this can be in such a way that the lower realm still remains a lower realm, meaning it's not elevated in any way, even though the Jew is doing some positive things there. It simply receives some sort of positive influence from above by virtue of the fact that there's people doing positive, acting in a positive way there and bringing holiness into that place. Right? But that's the first level. Afterwards, there has to be a higher level of avodah. What's that? The rectification and the purification of this place is to such an extent that this place itself, through its particular and unique characteristics, becomes a place of Torah and mitzvahs. Meaning, there's two aspects to the whole thing. Now, it's obviously harder to do in certain places than other places, but in a major Jewish center in Chutz La'aretz, so then someone can, Chabad opens up. Okay, so Chabad can open up there, and all sorts of people. I'm just mentioning Lubavitch for obvious reasons, because that's where we are, right? Opens up a Chabad house there. Okay, so it becomes a place where Baruch Hashem, all sorts of good things are happening, but the place doesn't change, right? Place but what if you turn that place into a Makom Torah? What if all of a sudden that city becomes a place where it's full of yeshivas, it has a well-known yeshiva, people come from other places to that place to learn Torah, so then you've completely transformed the place. So I was going to bring a very clear example of that in a minute.
If you have like a Goyish place with where there aren't Jews, it can't get to that second level? Even
Well,
if
it's
they're
going to be
keeping, like,
very,
notes
I
about
mean,
loads
theoretically you could, but it's going to be very hard if you don't have enough Jewish infrastructure to transform the city. You're just going to try to maintain,
status
you know,
quo
keep the
almost,
Jews there alive as opposed to turn it into a bustling Torah center. I mean, theoretically you could, but what do you need a lot of resources for that? So there's certain places don't have the resources for that, right? Right. So in a town where there are, 15,000 Jews and there's a lot of money, even though there's no Yiddishkeit, yes, that place you could do it because there's a lot of money and you could open a yeshiva there and make things happen and turn it into a place where people come from other places. That you could do. Some place in the middle of Kansas where you opened up a Chabad, Schellenberg. Schellenberg, where is he? We have a former student who opened up a Chabad house on a campus just outside of Cape Town. They're the only Jews there other than the students on campus. So it's not going to end up being a Jewish center. People aren't going to leave Joburg and go to this place to learn Torah. But what's he doing? He's elevating the place in an amazing way by having this Chabad house there. It's unbelievable what's going on. Right? Torah center, hard to imagine, right? Might he make his campus a place that Jewish kids say, oh, you know what, you can go learn over there and maybe that's a good place to learn because there's a lot happening in a Jewish way. Oh, okay, so that's already the second step to a certain degree, right? But as the Rebbe is going to bring an example, Sarfat, in a minute, right? France, right? Which is the lowest place on earth and yet has been turned into a place with unbelievable Yiddishkeit. The people go there to learn in yeshiva because Brun was as good a yeshiva as there is in the world. I'm not going to talk about it. Right? Base. This lower place, it still maintains its specific characteristic. Becomes a place of Torah mitzvahs. Al Yadeshim Mekimim Sham Mezdeh Shel Torah, because you establish Makimim Sham, you establish there, set up there literally. Mezdeh Shel Torah, institutions of Torah, Tefillah, Gemilas Chasadim. Okay, so anybody, any town can be transformed to a certain degree by virtue of the fact you open up a Jewish school in that town, you open up certain other Jewish institutions in that town. So that's very important. That's amazing. Right? Bate Kinesias, Bate Medrashes, you open up shuls and schools. So the place becomes an independent place of Yiddishkeit. It becomes a Yiddish Shtat. It's a place where people will send their children to go learn in yeshiva over there. Okay, so now many towns try that. Right? There are places that try that, and some succeed and some don't. Right? Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. Right? In smaller towns, New York's New York, Los Angeles is Los Angeles, Miami is Miami, Joburg is Joburg, Melbourne is Melbourne. Sydney, they're still trying, right? They just opened another yeshiva in Sydney, right? Sydney's always been a place where it's hard to turn it into a Makam Torah. Are there a lot of Frum Jews there? Yes, there are Frum Jews there. Never turned, most of the serious Frum Jews at a certain point, what do if they live in Sydney? They move to Melbourne. Better education, nicer, gentlemen, we're in class. Nicer Mazdays, etc. Right? Okay? Just easier place to be a Yid. What's in Melbourne? Melbourne's been turned into a Makam Torah, there's no question. Right? There's yeshivas and schools and this and that. Joburg also has all sorts of things, all sorts of opportunities. Though yeshiva, Rabbi Wagner tried. Right? Rabbi Wagner tried to turn Melbourne into a place where people would come from other places in the world to a good yeshiva, to Joburg, and it didn't work. Right? There's still something there, whatever he's got, but for a while there was a yeshiva that people used to go to, but it didn't work. Is Joburg a Makam Torah? Yes, there's lots going on in Johannesburg, there's no question. Right? Okay, so what was it before the Yidden showed up? A bunch of Afrikaners, right?
Looking for gold.
Looking for gold, right? Sydney, it hasn't worked yet, though they just opened another yeshiva 2 years ago in Sydney, a smicha program with about 10, 12 bachrim, and they're making an impact on the city. One of those bachrim, unfortunately, a child of a friend, is in hospital right now, undergoing different surgeries to try to bring him back to where he was a few days ago. So it should be the Mezdas of Torah, Tefillah, Gemilah, Sosadim. Now all places have these sort of things, but do they turn into a place of Torah Mamish? Some yes, some no. Bate Knesses, Bate Midrashes, right? Shuls and yeshivas, right? That's what's usually missing from most places. Everyone has a shul. Right? What turns a place into a Makam Torah? A yeshiva. And it just changes the whole character of the town. There's Bachrim sitting there and learning. Kach, kashamakam nasa ki'ilu ba'ofen atzmi, the place becomes as if it's in an independent way. Ve'ena zakuk means coming from below. It doesn't need the influence from above. Ve'ena zakuk lashpa shel kedusha mimakim elyon yeser. It doesn't require influence from a higher place. Right? That's the second level, the Rebbe says, in terms of transforming Golas. Right? V'yaseidim yizu, furthermore, loyra ki'ilu, not only ki'ilu, it becomes a place of, stands on its own feet. It actually reveals the advantage of this low place itself, of the Tachtin, of the lower realms themselves. And remember the diuk the Rebbe has said yesterday was a very interesting diuk. Diuk b'tachtonim, different expressions of the lower realms. Meaning we usually translate it the lower realms, Beseder, but each place is a lower realm, and there's all sorts of different places with their different characteristics. Right? The place itself becomes a place where there's Yiddishkeit, and you feel the Yiddishkeit, and you see the Yiddishkeit. And if you drive around the place, you run into it. It's not necessarily downtown, might be, not necessarily, but if there's, there's now a yeshiva in Phoenix. Right? So I don't know what Phoenix looks like. I don't know where the yeshiva is. I imagine it's probably in Scottsdale because that's sort of where these things happen. But I don't know what it looks like. But if there is, if indeed there's 100 Bochim sitting and learning in Phoenix, so that means people driving around Phoenix, what do they see? See a whole different reality than they might have seen a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, before they ever opened up a yeshiva in Phoenix. Right? Sometimes, again, sometimes these places succeed, sometimes not. But if they succeed, they change the whole nature of the town completely. Ba'adrabba, anshi amokim peilim b'Torah mitzvahs miyuzmosam ha'atzmis. The people in this place now involve themselves in Torah mitzvahs from their own initiative, because it's there. It's part of the fabric of the town. In line with this particular characteristics of that town, right? So a yeshiva bacher you see walking around Phoenix, this doesn't mean he shouldn't have a hat and a jacket on, but he's probably going to look a little different than a yeshiva bacher walking around in New York, because the guy in New York is going to have a coat and a scarf and maybe an umbrella, right? But in Phoenix, he probably doesn't need that. If he has an umbrella, it's to keep the sun off. Halak Bani Musa, there's a beautiful story about the Rebbe and umbrellas. The Rebbe, before his Rebbe, was standing out on the street talking to someone, having a conversation with someone, and it was snowing. So the person had an umbrella, and he kept trying to get the Rebbe to stand under the umbrella, and the Rebbe refused to stand under. He refused. He just, didn't stand under there. So finally, the gentleman the Rebbe was talking to asked, and the Rebbe wasn't the Rebbe, he asked him, why won't you stand under the umbrella? The Rebbe said an amazing line. You ever see a soldier with an umbrella? That's what the Rebbe said. Can you imagine a soldier in the field with his umbrella and his gun? Right? That's what the Rebbe said. We never saw the Rebbe with an umbrella. No, we didn't see the Rebbe. We saw the Rebbe walking. The Rebbe used to walk.
People also say it was like, because it was directly from the body, you wanted to feel it.
Mm-hmm.
Huh?
That's not what he said. That's what you would say. That's not what he said. He said, you ever see a soldier with an umbrella? That's what the Rebbe said. Right? It's such an amazing story. Right? Also, lakarta, halach b'nimuse. You go to a place, so you act in accordance with their particular customs. Right? Okay, again, the Rebbe said, obviously, all those customs which are mutter al pi Torah. So that's, business dealings, etc., etc. Right? Right? Shalamakam ahu shebehem misiachid makam zeh mimakem esacherim. This sets this place aside from other places. Al pi zeh, based on this, Yuvana ilu ishal dareinu zeh, we understand the special character of this generation. Legabe adara shelafanenu, relative to the daras before. Now, obviously, what's unique about this generation? We are more scattered in this generation than any other generation in the history of the Jewish people. There are Jews everywhere. Okay, so what the disadvantage of that is obvious. The advantage of that is that Yidden can elevate more of Elam Hazeh than they ever could before, right? What the Frierdiker Rebbe always referred to as Chatzi Kadar Atachton, the lower part of the globe. Now, he didn't mean lower in terms of Australia as opposed to Europe, because there's no lower and upper, right? I mean, there's south and north, but there's no lower and upper, right? When you look up in Australia, you don't see Indonesia, you see the sun. You look down in America, we always used to say, where I grew up, so it was easy to go to California because it's downhill. You just get on a skateboard and zip down to California. The problem is getting back. It's all uphill. Well, no, it's not how it works, right? Okay, so there's no up and down per se. What is Chatzi Kadar Atachton? Chatzi Kadar Atachton is that part of the world where Yidden basically didn't get, and where Yiddishkeit Bechlal didn't get. Where was their Yiddishkeit before 1900? Europe, North Africa, India. That was it. That's where there was Yiddishkeit. Anywhere else? Where's there Yiddishkeit now? There's nowhere where there isn't. There's nowhere where there isn't. Air India has local kosher food. Right? They don't have to get their kosher food from Gaddafi in London anymore, which is what they used to have to do. Right? Now you fly in Air India, you're eating Shchitas Lubavitch chicken on the plane, and I'm going to get in trouble because I'm being filmed, but it's the only, you get those little cards, right? The caterer gives you a little card and explains this is who we are. It's the only card that says Yehi Adineinu Moreinu Reveinu on the bottom of the card. India, right? You have to fly Air India to get Mishichist food, right? Because there's 17 shluchim in America and in India, and almost all of them are Mishichist, right? So the guy who's in charge of the food, Kupchak, takes care of the food. He's in Delhi. So that, he doesn't cook it, but he's the one who makes sure there's food on Air India, because, Delhi's the biggest airport. That's where most people, not biggest airport, but that's where most people are flying through. But that's where the food comes from. Shchitas Lubavitch on Air India. Right? You used to also get Shchitas Lubavitch on Aeroflot. Who was making sure there was kosher food on Aeroflot? Lubavitchers in Russia, right? I mean, it's most Yiddishkeit in Russia is Lubavitch, right? So certain places like that. There's one other, I don't remember which. Oh, Australia. Okay. Australia. So Australia, it's not necessary. It is, kosher Australia is a Lubavitcher, but it's not necessarily Lubavitch Shchita. It just happens to be that all of the chickens in Lubavitch, every chicken you buy, in any kosher store in Lubavitch, in Australia, Shchitas Lubavitch. The meat, there's non-Lubavitch meat in Australia. There's no non-Lubavitch chickens. The only shchita of chickens is Lubavitch shchita of chickens. So you can on Qantas, you don't have to only eat Shchitas Lubavitch, but if that's all you do, so then Qantas Airlines, that's what I was talking about. Right? Earlier generations, the Yiddishkeit was in a relatively limited area. Where is it now? Everywhere. That's the preparation for Mashiach. In the previous generations, there was not a scattering that was so great of the Jewish people in all corners of the world, as exists in our generation. When the Frierdiker Rebbe came to America, he talked about bringing Yiddishkeit to the Chatzi Kadar Atachton. Now, there was already Yiddishkeit in America when the Frierdiker Rebbe got there. The Frierdiker Rebbe got there when? What year? Goyish, you can do Goyish. What year? 1940. Running away from the Rebbe was in Poland and miraculously was taken out of Poland was arrested in Warsaw by German intelligence in order to get the Rebbe out of Europe. The Americans still had diplomatic relations with Germany until Pearl Harbor. So when the American government was told that there's a very holy Jew in Poland, and could they try to help get him out, so they got in touch with their contacts in Germany. The German intelligence was anti-Hitler, and tried to kill them a couple of times. They failed, but they found an intelligence officer in Warsaw, very strange-looking fellow. There's a picture of him. But he found, and I don't know whether the Rebbe knew about this, so I don't know whether the Rebbe exactly wanted to be arrested. I'm not sure how the whole story worked, but Tachlis, they arrested the Rebbe. They had to bring the Rebbe to get from Poland to Sweden to put the Rebbe on a boat. So they had to go through Germany, so they had to keep the Rebbe out of the hands of the SS while bringing the Rebbe through Germany and processing him as a prisoner. And then they took him, the German intelligence smuggled him into the north and put him on a boat, Baruch Hashem, and the Rebbe got to America. 1940. Tes Adar, 9th day of Adar, 1940. Miraculous story, unbelievable, crazy story. And our Rebbe at that point was in France and got out on the last boat and got to America in the end of Sivan, 1941, the next year, with the Rebbe. That was also quite amazing because the Rebbe had booked a ticket on a boat and got a telegram from the Frierdiker Rebbe not to get on the boat. So now this is life and death, because if you don't get on the boat, who knows whether you're going to get out of this place. But okay, the Rebbe didn't get on the boat because the Frierdiker Rebbe said not to get on the boat. That was the passenger ship that the German submarine blew up, which was a big scandal in the Second World War, because you're supposed to fight wars nicely, right? You're not supposed to blow up passenger ships. Wars have rules, right? So people were very upset that the Germans were doing that. Putting Jews in ovens didn't upset anybody. That wasn't breaking the rules. But blowing up a passenger ship caused quite a ruckus. So the Rebbe wasn't on the boat. Got on the next boat, leaving Portugal. And Baruch Hashem, Jewish life would be a little different if that didn't happen. B'daras akadmi lo yapizer kol gadol. Right? It wasn't so. Jews weren't scattered everywhere. But kol kitzvei tevel, kafishu kayim b'dareinu zeh loimi boy, and that's certainly not even necessary to say, borrowing language from the Gemara. B'zman shebeis hamikdash hayakayim. Certainly in the times of the Beis Hamikdash, almost all of the Yidden were relatively close to the Beis Hamikdash. Kishu b'nei Yisrael yu be'eretz Yisrael, the Yidden were in Eretz Yisrael. There were a few Yidden that didn't live in Eretz Yisrael at that time. Also, they were involved in business and they would be traveling, but still they were based in Eretz Yisrael. And its surroundings. I mean, there were people in the surrounding areas because they were involved in business in those places. Even in the first generations of Golus, when we were scattered, we were sent out of Eretz Yisrael. Still, what? He's Gadar Yehudim Rakba Bendinas Misayomis. We only lived in certain countries. Al Kol Panim Rakba Chatzi Kadar Elyon. And here the Rebbe uses the words. The upper part of the world. That's not really the upper part of the world. It's relative to, meaning it's called the Chatzi Kadar Elyon because that's where the Yidden were. And generally they were somewhere relatively close to Eretz Yisrael because we came from Eretz Yisrael and spread out. So we spread out into Europe, we spread out into North Africa, got to India somehow, and there's been a community there forever. But that was about it. Masha'ein Kain B'Daris Ucharim Yeser, later generations, he's Pasu Yehudim B'Medinas Rabbis Yeser, more countries, Achagam Yigil L'Chatzi Kadar Tachta, until we actually came to the lower half of the world, B'America V'Chulei, America and other such places, meaning that the three most populated places in the lower part of the world, two of them really are Australia, South Africa, and the Americas. Jews made it to America. Then Jews also made it to South America, Central America, South America, mostly in South America. Jews were never there before. Ubechol dar v'dar nesas teisefes. It's increased. bekach. Ad shebedereinu anu, until our generation, sheyehudim mitzvim b'kol kitzvei tevel mamish. They're found in every place in the world. Ve'mekaimim sham, not only are they found in these places, but mekaimim sham Torah mitzvahs. They're actually doing Torah mitzvahs in these places. I wonder why they're doing Torah mitzvahs, and they might have something to do with the gentleman whose book we're reading right now. Right? He had something to do with the fact that all these places were imbued with Torah mitzvahs, because he kept sending shluchim to all these ridiculous places, and they made them into places of Torah mitzvahs. Even though it was all happening lefim minhagei hamokim. If you go to a Chabad house in Phoenix, so it probably looks like another house in Phoenix. It's got that, sort of pink sandstone desert look. Okay, all right, that's what it's going to look like. That's what things look like around here if you're in Phoenix. Okay, but instead of being a house where people are, doing whatever people do in Phoenix, there's a pool in the back, and they're, sitting on the patio with their martini and swimming in the pool. So instead of that, there's minyanim and Torah classes and all sorts of things going on in the house next door. A different place. Right? Same house, but different place. Until they established and continue to establish mezdei shel Torah u'mitzvahs akol makom lefi inyanei. Right? So the idea of a Chabad house came about in the 70s, early 70s. The Rebbe started talking about an idea called the Chabad house. What's that? A place where Jewish people can walk into even if they don't want to daven. A holy Jewish place, right? A Chabad house, as opposed to what existed until Chabad houses showed up? Synagogues. When you go into the synagogue, you go into the synagogue if you want to pray. What if you don't want to pray? Well, what's you doing in the synagogue if you don't want to pray? Right? Okay, nothing to do. You don't want to pray, you can walk into a Chabad house. What's there? There's a cup of coffee, there's some donuts, there's some books. Who knows? There might even be a ping pong table in the basement. I don't know. Who knows? Whatever goes on in the Chabad house, right? The idea is the Jews should walk in, and if they walk in, they might end up praying, they might end up putting on tefillin, that was the Rebbe's idea. The Rebbe said. Should be a place where a Yid can walk in, a Jewish place where a Yid can walk in, even though he doesn't want to daven. What a chiddush. Amazing. And how many of those are there now? Thousands. In Delhi, when people walk into the Chabad house, what do they walk into the Chabad house for? Directions. Directions. Which train to take? I'm going here, and which bus, and where to right. Almost. Well, the one time I spent any time in the Chabad house. So in Delhi, in the market, there's two Chabad houses in Delhi. There's one in the neighborhood where a lot of Israeli diplomats and business people live, and also a lot of local businessmen, Jewish businessmen, etc. And then there's the Chabad house in the bazaar. What do they call the bazaar? What's it called? The bazaar, I think it's called. And it is the wildest place I've ever seen in my life, and that's full of young Israelis who. When I flew Air India, I would say 2/3 of the young Israelis that I saw on the plane, I saw 2 hours later in the Chabad house. Almost everybody. Almost all the young Israelis who were on the plane, their first stop was the Chabad house in Delhi. Get a nice warm welcome. Sadiq! Ma nishma? Hinachta tefillin hayom? Lined up. Wrapping tefillin. I put my bags down and started wrapping tefillin. There were too many people. They couldn't take care of it. And what are they there? Kosher restaurant, place to stay, or across the street there's hostels, the little hotels for $2 a night, $4 a night that are clean and fine and nice, no problem. Not going to get robbed. And what do they spend their day? They spend a day or two in Delhi, acclimatizing and learning where to go. There's maps, train schedules, it's all there, right? Lefi minhag hamakib, right? You go to a place, so you act like they do. So what do you need if you live in India? What do you need? A train schedule. You have to know the trains. Okay, so train schedules. So they can help them out with what they tell. Oh, we want to go to Goa. Okay, here. You go here. This is how you do it. Then you go there. Okay. That's what's going on in the Chabad house in Delhi. Right? There's minyanim, 3 minyanim a day, and there's a kosher restaurant, good food, cheap, right? That's where they go. Right? Baruch Hashem. So everybody knows. Get off the plane and go to the Chabad house. They don't want to daven. They might end up davening, but that isn't why they went. But what did they get? They got some nice Jewish food and some warmth and some camaraderie, and they met all sorts of other Israelis there, right? They're all sitting and schmoozing. Right? There's the joke in India that an Indian once asked one of the Israelis, how many people live in Israel? How many Israelis are there? He said, it's 7 million. No, not here in India. In Israel, how many are there? I never saw a scene like that in my life. It was amazing. And I must say, I'll fly the flag, the only person in the world who would possibly have the insight to make that happen is called the Lubavitcher Rebbe. No one else would think of it. Not even close. Right? It's unbelievable what goes on there. I was waiting for my cab back to the airport. I had my bags. I was on my way to Australia. I had my bag sitting there. And the shliach said, he knows my kids. He said, RB Kaplan, a lot of covered there. RB Kaplan, tzrichim ezra. So I spent the last 15 minutes before the cab came, wrapping one after the other in tefillin. Just as fast as you could wrap, they were coming. Right? A plane must have landed because they were just coming up the steps. Now they have a new building. I haven't been in the new building. They built a nice big new building. They have a mikveh. Two little weird alleyways down in the market. There's a mikveh. As you walk along the main, what's that street called? I think it's called Main Road or something. It's got like some name, Broadway. I know what it's called. The main street of the bazaar in Delhi. Across the street is a big, huge banner, Beis Chabad, big picture of the Rebbe, across the main street in the bazaar in Delhi, India. That's what the Rebbe's talking about here. Right? It's the end of Gullus, elevating all these places. If you can elevate that place, you can elevate anywhere. It is one of the wildest places I've ever been in my life. Wild in a good way. It was just, wow, what a place. If you could harness that energy, you could light up a whole city with the energy that's going on around there. When I asked a local where the Chabad house is, he said, Yechia Melech. And he told me over there, a local guy selling corn on the street. He had a big pot, right? They had a big pot with corn in the pot, and you wanted to buy corn on it was on the cob, right? You want to buy some corn. So I figured, well, he must know what's going on. He sits there all day. So I said, where's Chabad? Yechia Melech. And he says, it's over there. I said, wow. This is really dir b'tachtonim mamish. Okay. So that's this generation. And we take it for granted, but it's not taken for granted. Someone saw to it that that's what was going to happen in this generation. Right? And each generation it adds, and our generation it's mamish unbelievable. Ad she'ikimu mamshichim lahakim meizder shel Torah mitzvah kol makom v'makom lefi inyan. Okay, second last paragraph on the right column in page 401. When a person contemplates this, even for a short moment, we see the incredible advantage of our generation and the loftiness of our generation relative to the generations before us. In what particular aspect? Because there's already been a rectification and an elevation of every country in the world. Kimat every country has a Chabad house, has some Yiddishkeit, has someone doing mitzvahs in that place. It's absolutely astounding. And as was explained earlier, in a number of times, based on all of the signs, if we look around in the world, we've already finished. The Rebbe talked about this every week at this time. The beginning of the winter of, it was not still 1991, it was Tafshin and Beis, but it was still 1991. All of the rectifications have been completed. Therefore it's understood why we are found now so close to the Geula. Everything's based on klal and prat. What's klal and prat? General reality and detailed reality. This thing that we just talked about, Shleimus Bidur Eilam, the completion of the rectification of the world so that it's a place that's ready for Mashiach. Mishtakev, we said we're going to pick a particular example. And it's interesting because the week before the Rebbe talked about Tzarfas, he brought it up. And this week, as I mentioned, there was this whole big, huge group from France. The first thing the Rebbe said at the beginning of the Farangin was say L'chaim in French to the group in the pyramid at the front of 770. And the Rebbe talks now in this part of the Sikha, fascinating explanation of the history of France in Jewish terms. Mishtakev v'miyuchad b'birur shemedinas Tzarfas. Tzarfat. Ubehektim, shebe'echad miyudei geula. One of the statements of geula that's found in Tanakh, shebehaftarah Shabbos Shavra, that's in the Haftarah of Parshas Vayishlach, ne'emra b'mafurish Medina Tzarfas. France is mentioned in Haftarah. V'golas achel lizeh l'bnei Yisrael ad Tzarfas. They will reach even Sarfat, the Golas that's being talked about. In Navi, they mentioned Sarfat. It was there, right? It's not like it appeared. Right? Charles de Gaulle wasn't, but Sarfat was. Yerishu Esarei Negev, and then what's going to happen? We're going to all come back from these far-flung places. Va'alu, and then the famous pasuk, Va'alu, and Rashi quotes it in the beginning of the Torah in Vayishlach relative to Yaakov and Esav meeting. When Esav invites Yaakov to come to Seir, what does Yaakov say? What does Yaakov say? Va'alu meishim bartzion lishbet esar Esav vaysav lavai amlucha. I will come, but not until Mashiach comes. And that pasuk is talking about Mashiach, right? That there'll be an ultimate judging of Har Esav when vaysav l'shem amlucha, when the malchus of the Kadosh Baruch is revealed in the whole world. So that pasuk in Ovadia. So, and Ovadia, the Navi Ovadia, the Haftarah in Parshas Vayishlach is the whole book of Ovadia, and he mentions Tzarfas. The Tzarech Lahavi, Rabbi says, Mizeh she'Navi mefaret es hagolus v'hageulah shel Tzarfas. The fact that the Navi mentions specifically, details, the golus of Tzarfas, but also the Geula from Tzarfas. Muvan shekayem is shaychus miyuchedes b'neihem. So obviously some important connection between these two things. Shari afilu im betchilas agolus. Even if at the beginning of Golus Huglu, they were expelled Yehudim letzarfas, they ended up in Tzarfas, right? That's where we went. That was one of the places we went first, Europe, right? And ultimately made it as far as Tzarfas, right? So lamai nafkamina. So, but still, what difference does it make? Hazkara mefuresha shelo davar b'pasuk. Why is this mentioned specifically in a pasuk? I mean, there are other places the Yidden went also. Why does Ovadia Dafka mention Sarfat? I mean, in order to get to Sarfat, you have to go through Roma, you have to go through Germania, to go through different places to get to Sarfat, right? So why is he Dafka mentioning Sarfat, right? Spain, a lot of Yidden in Spain until they were expelled in 1492 by them. There were a lot of Yidden in Spain, right? They're called Sfardim for a reason. Right? Where do the Sfardim come from? Spain. That's why they're called Sfardim. How do you say Spain in Lashon HaKodesh? Spain in Hebrew, what is it? Sfarad, right? Oh, gee. Sfardim, right? Yeah, that's where they came from, right? A lot of Yidden, half of the Jewish people. It was a third of the Jewish people until the war. But a third of the Jewish people were wiped out, a little more, like almost half. And, okay. So why is it mentioned Dafka Tzarfas? Ubafrat b'yud Isaac, particularly relative to that which is being dealt with b'hascholas agolas lefi kimat alpayim shana ela b'geula. Why is Tzarfat mentioned not only relative to the beginning of the Golus, which happened 2,000 years ago, and wasn't so long after Ovadia? It was quite a while, Ovadia's first temple, but talking about the Geula from Tzarfas. By the time the Geula comes, well, there's a lot going on in addition to Tzarfat by the time Mashiach's coming, right? Because here we are with all these places where Yidden are, and Mashiach's coming otot. So the Rebbe says some amazing things, absolutely amazing. Hadavarim yuvnu la'or chidish. These things will be understood. based on the Chiddush Vashinu B'Yachas Shel Yisrael B'Doreinu Zeh, based on the novelty and the change in the relationship of the Jewish people in this generation, the Medina Tzarfas, the Tzarfat. L'gabe Yachas Shai B'Doreinu Shel Admar Zokin. Our generation, as opposed to the generation of the Alter Rebbe. Now, what in the world has the Alter Rebbe got to do with Tzarfat?
He opposed them versus Russia.
He opposed Napoleon. Napoleon was, in the days of the Alter Rebbe, there was a guy named Napoleon. I think that history goes back before 1986, I think. And there was a guy named Napoleon. Napoleon was trying to take over the world as it was then. I mean, they had smaller understandings as to what the world was, right? But Napoleon was basically trying to take over the world, and he was doing a pretty good job. He took over all of Europe, and the place that ultimately ended up being impossible for him to take over, as it was Baruch Hashem about 150 years later when some other creep tried to take over the world. So what caused him to lose to a great degree was his inability to take over Russia. A guy named Hitler, Yimach Shmei. So he also lost because of that. He lost also. The Americans had a lot to do with it when they entered the war. There's no question about it. But if Hitler hadn't tried to take over Russia when he did, who knows what would have happened. But Baruch Hashem, he also lost by virtue of trying to take over Russia. And Napoleon lost trying to take over Russia. But most of the Jews, and including the rabbinic leaders all over Europe, the Alter Rebbe stood alone and was chastised because of this. The Alter Rebbe was on the side of the Tsar and not on the side of Napoleon. Right? We talked about this earlier. What did Napoleon promise the Jews? Emancipation. What would emancipation lead to, the Alter Rebbe said? Yidden would be free in Gashmias, but lose their ruchnias. They'd lose their spirituality. Well, certainly history since then has borne that out, right? On one level, it's been the most successful gullus in the history of the Jewish people. It's called America. On the other hand, it's been the most disastrous gullus in the history of the Jewish people in terms of losing Jews hand over fist. So, okay. So, the Alter Rebbe's relationship with Tzarfas and our relationship with Tzarfas is completely different. Yedua. Shebetkufas Admar Zokin, in the times of the Alter Rebbe, Keshet Parza Milchama Bein Napoleon and Tzarfasi, when the war broke out between Napoleon, the French leader, Tsar Alexander Arussi, and the Tsar Alexander, who was an absolute anti-Semite, horrible creep. Right? Savar Admar Zokin. The Alter Rebbe opined, not like other Gedolim felt. And there was a particular Chassidish Rebbe who the Alter Rebbe had a serious disagreement with in this whole story. That regarding the goodness of the situation, the spiritual situation of the Yidden in matters of fear of God, it's best that Russia should win. For the goof of the Jew, there's no question it was going to be better under Napoleon. For the soul of the Jew, the Alter Rebbe was absolutely clear it was going to be better under the Russians. And that was borne out. There should be a fall of Tzarfat. Base pay, Bonaparte, Napoleon. Yurba ha'oisher b'Yisrael, it will increase the riches of the Jewish people. V'yurim keren Yisrael, and so to speak, the horn of Am Yisrael will be raised up. In other words, the Jews will have an easier life. Aval yispardu v'yisrachaku liban shel Yisrael mi'avin sheb'shamayim, but it will be separated and distanced, the heart of the Jewish people from their Father in heaven. Ve'im yinatzeach Aleph, didn't even mention their names, that's Alexander. Im ki yurba oini b'Yisrael, even though this will increase the poverty of the Jewish people. Ve'yushbal keren Yisrael, and the Jews will be downtrodden. Aval yiskashu v'yischabru v'yisagdu liban shel Yisrael aviyim b'shabayim, but it will connect the Jews to their Father in heaven. Now, why we're like that? So that we can ask ourselves, right? I mean, why do Jews have to be like that? So that if things are good, all of a sudden they decide that it's all because of them and not because of God, and they leave Yiddishkeit. But that's the history of the Jewish people. When things are good, we blow it. Because we decide it's good because I'm such a good businessman instead of God's giving me a lot of money. Right? And so what do I need Shabbos for? It's just what happens. If we weren't like that, the Alter Rebbe wouldn't have had to make that decision, but for some strange reason, that's the way we are. We respond better to challenges than we respond to good times. Hatam Laka, Germany, right? Best place in Europe for the Jews. Friest place in Europe for the Jews, right? Where were the Jews completely fry? Germany. Right? The Yiddishkeit that failed completely in Europe was German Yiddishkeit. Just failed. People fried out in a way that no, it wasn't happening anywhere else in Europe to the extent that it was there. There were other places where, there were disasters. Hungary is pretty disastrous. There were, Poland before the war, so about 17% of the population of Poland was Jewish. Right? And most of those Jews were from. 250,000 Ger Hasidim were killed by the Nazis. Just Ger. Probably 150,000 Alexander Hasidim. You've probably never heard of the Alexander Hasidim. Why would you have heard of the Alexander Hasidim? They were all wiped out during the war. Right? Which Hasidim made it after the war? The Hasidim whose Rebbe was still alive after the war. Bobov, Belz, Ger, Lubavitch. Satmar, there wasn't Satmar before the war. The Satmar Rebbe took care of a lot of people during the war and after the war, and so Satmar came to being after the war. Satmar Rebbe was responsible for taking care of many, 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 many Jews. Right?
It's on Instagram that they like celebrate their like Rebbe's not getting captured by the Nazis like 2 days after maybe Gimel Kislev, Half Gimel Kislev or something.
Yeah. It was a couple of days ago. Yeah, it's a big day. Right. What's ironic? Who saved the Satmar Rav? He was the Satmar Rav. He became the Satmar Rebbe. He was called the Satmar. I was in Satmar, Satu Mari, Saint Mary. It's the name of the town in now Romania. It was Hungary in those days. Now it's Romania. Satu Mari, the Saint Mary Hasidim. She weren't no saint, but whatever, right? So it was the Satmar Rav. It's very interesting. We went into the shul. This was 1978. We went into the shul, and you weren't allowed to have a mezuzah on a door in Romania in those days. So all the mezuzahs that had been up in the shul were just in a drawer in the shul. And there was one old yid there. I don't know how this guy was still there. He looked like a Satmar Chassid. He looked like a Chassid. So he saw us coming, and he took us around the shul and showed us around, and he asked us to take mezuzahs away. He said, they're just sitting in the drawer. Take them. Maybe some of them are kosher. So we took some mezuzahs. We each took one. Unbelievable ksav, just gorgeous. Pre-war mezuzahs. But Pasul, the one I had was Pasul. But I still have it. Beautiful mezuzah. Put it in my Torah or. Actually, it's in my Likutei Torah. It's in there. Mezuzah from Satmar. Right? But who saved the Satmar Rav? It's so ironic. He was saved by the Tzionim. Right? Some of the Zionist authorities who had sent people to Europe to save Jews, so they didn't generally save from Jews because they didn't really want those Jews here because they were just going to cause problems. But they did save a lot of Jews, and it happens to be one of the Jews they saved in Hungary was the Satmar Rav. Just sort of ironic, because he's sort of the symbol of anti-Zionism. But I mean, But Chav Gimel Kislev, yeah. This came up in shul last week because of I think Shabbos was Chav Gimel. Shabbos was Chav Gimel, so someone mentioned it in shul. Right. He was a Gaon Adir. He was an unbelievable guy in Torah, the Satmar Rav. Unbelievable. So, why was the Rebbe against Tzarfas? Hatam lekach. Let's go a few more minutes. 402, second paragraph on the right. Hatam lekach. Hayo ki Tzarfas v'roshus Napoleon hemida atzma kemevia es ruach hachofesh rachmana litzlan. Freedom, liberty, right? What's the three things they have on their, liberté is one of them. I don't know what the other two are, right? But freedom from what? Mikol inyanei dat ve'emunah b'Kadosh Baruch Hu, from all matters of religion and faith in the Kadosh Baruch Hu. The klipa zu shel malchus Tzarfas, and this klipa of the kingship of Tzarfas, Napoleon, shehiv says tekef a klipa v'adin akasha, right? That brought about an incredibly powerful expression of klipa and a very powerful expression of stern judgment unto the world. Machmas geus, the gaiva, the haughtiness, visnasus, and the, hisnasus can be positive or negative, right? But in this context, it's negative. The feeling of superiority, to rely only on his power and his strength. Lemar, to say, it's my power and the power of my hand that's bringing about all of this greatness. The Eibushter is not involved. And he did away with the hashgacha, the fact that the Eibushter is watching the world, and emuna and bitochen in a Kadosh Baruch Hu. Bedugmas klipas Sancherev, like Sancherev, very similar to all the stories about Sancherev in Tanakh and then in the Gemara, mostly in the last parak in Sanhedrin. Like the Mittler Rebbe explained afterwards what was going on in terms of the Alter Rebbe's relationship with Napoleon and why he saw him as he saw him. And this wasn't just something temporary, it was going to affect everything in generations afterwards, and it did affect everything in generations afterwards, there's no question. Right? The French Revolution was in 1789. Right? So the Alter Rebbe was in jail 9 years later. The Napoleonic Wars were when? It's a famous date. There's a famous symphony named after it. 1812. The 1812 Overture. Tchaikovsky. Russian. Right? Perfectly reasonable for a Russian to write a joyous song at that time. It was a tough time. So a lot of people died. Right? But it was the winter. So it got them, right? So it got the Nazis also, Baruch Hashem, the Russian winter. Napoleon's troops couldn't deal with the Russian winter. And the Russian troops could. And just like the Nazis, Baruch Hashem, the Nazis couldn't deal with the Russian winter. And the Russians could. And so the Nazis turned and fled. And that had a lot to do with the Allies winning the war. I thank the Eibushter for the tough Russian winter. Right? Because if it weren't for that, we wouldn't be sitting here doing what we're doing. Not all beat ever. The French Revolution in 1789, as what came as a result of this? Napoleon. It was an ideological revolution, Inyan Kloli, that brought about a complete change in the whole world at large. And what was that? Freedom, democracy. Okay, democracy is a nice thing. But unfortunately, what does democracy also seem to include? Freedom from any authority, right? I mean, I can vote the bum out. Who else can I vote out? I can vote God out of my life. That's the legacy of democracy. Not that there's all sorts of I think every single one of us would rather live in a democratic system than any other system, but it has its disadvantages. One of the things, it took quite a while, but one of the things that disappeared over time, or is disappearing pretty quickly, the family unit is disappearing in democratic systems. Why? The family is not a democratic unit. It's an autocratic unit. Parents say, children do. Nope. I have a vote. You're 12. You don't have a vote. Yes, I do. I have a vote. And sometimes the parents swallow that and thinks that, that's when it breaks down, is when the parents lose sight of who they are and they decide that their 12-year-old has a vote. The 12-year-old's 12. He's cute, but he's an idiot. Don't let him make decisions that are serious decisions, because he's still an idiot. right? He's not an idiot because he doesn't know. He's just 12. Like, it's existential, right? At some point, I mean, you wouldn't let him get married, right? Okay, so then don't let him make serious decisions, right? Okay. No, everybody should be able to make their own decisions. No, 12-year-olds shouldn't be able to make their own decisions because they'll make bad ones, right? You make the decisions for them, right? You want to give them decisions? You can ask them what color they want their room painted. No problem. They can decide. Serious decisions? Don't let a 12-year-old make serious decisions because they'll probably make a bad decision. The modern 12-year-old. 12-year-old 200 years ago? I don't know. Maybe different. Right, but now, probably not a good idea. Okay. But that's a legacy of, one of the sociologists talk about this, the two things break down in democratic systems: religion and family, because those are not democratic realities. And democracy becomes a god unto itself as opposed to simply a useful system to govern people. It becomes something of absolute importance. Something of absolute importance. It's a wonderful way, if done properly, and in most of the Western world it's done pretty well, right, to run things, right? 100%. It's nice to have a say in things. Right? Okay, and if there's someone who's not doing a very good job, so you can replace them with someone who might do a better job. Right? Good idea. Okay. And where did that come from? Well, to a great degree, it came from the French Revolution. The American Revolution was very different than the French Revolution. What was the biggest difference in the American Revolution and the French Revolution? One short little word: God. The people who ran the American Revolution were very, very God-fearing people and made it part of the fabric of the country. And it lasted a long time. It's under attack now, but it lasted a very long time. What was the discussion as to what should be the official language of the United States of America? Hebrew. What's on the seal of Harvard and Columbia? Hebrew letters. If you walk on the seal at Columbia, it's a bit of a problem. If you walk on the seal of Columbia University as you walk up the steps into the main place in Columbia, I don't know what it is, I don't know what the building is, but someone once took me there. So there's a seal of Columbia, and what's on the seal? Yud Kei Vav Kei. It's written on the seal. So all these people are trampling all over Yud Kei Vav Kei. Now it's probably, it's separated enough that you could, but if you look at the seal you can look it up on Google, the seal of Columbia University, Yud Kei Vav Kei is in there. I think Harvard also has it, I'm not sure. But Harvard definitely has Hebrew in their seal. They were God-fearing people. Right? What does the Rebbe always say about the American economy? Why will it always be strong? What's written on the dollar? In God we trust. Rebbe stuck with it. Right? There was I have a copy of one actually, because it used to be on the subways in America. There was a big picture of a dollar. In God we trust. Count on it. It's on the money. Right? Now, on the money also means it's bull, it's good. It's it hits the spot, right? Count on it. It's put out by an organization called Chabad Lubavitch that was paid for all these things all over the subways in New York. So I have a little one in my house that's like this big, a little placard. And it says, it's a dollar bill, it says, in God we trust, count on it, it's on the money. Let's stop soon. Right. But the French Revolution was anti-God. It's completely different. Liberté, equalité, and one other one. I don't know what it was. Liberty, equality, and?
Fraternity.
Fraternité, okay. And that's, on the building, there's some building in France that has, that written across. I don't know what building it is, but if you go to Paris, right next to the Seine, I remember that much, I remember. Right? There's a building that has that written across. Fraternité, yeah. Brotherhood. Right? Second paragraph on the left. Right? I'm sorry, we'll start in the first paragraph on the left, because we didn't finish it. We'll just finish these two paragraphs and stop. Inyan kloli shevi meshinu yikar be'elam kule. The French Revolution brought about some very basic change in the world. Mapecha zu haisa echad. Because in all fairness, in 1776, America was fairly irrelevant. Right? It was a tiny little place. Now, they were relevant to Americans, right? But it was a tiny little place that had just freed itself from English rule. But it was irrelevant. It's a tiny little place, right? France wasn't irrelevant in 1789. France was the center of Europe in 1789. As a matter of fact, very soon afterwards, the leader of France took over Europe, right? Okay, so the fact that France had a revolution at that point was much more important than the fact that America had a revolution. Canada also got freed of the English in 1867. Who cares? Right? Like, it's completely irrelevant, right? So America also, like, I mean, the English cared, but who else cared? The French cared because they were so happy that the English lost. I mean, that was the extent of their caring. Oh, good, the English lost. But I mean, it was irrelevant relative to the rest of the world. It became relevant because of what America became. To its great credit, became an absolutely astounding experiment in how to run things. Completely unique and unbelievably successful. It's incredible, the success of America. I mean, we are watching people who are trying to bring it down now, which is rather depressing because the experiment's an amazing experiment in people getting together and trying to run a country where somehow the basic idea is that as many people as possible can have a good life. Well, a pretty good job at that. Absolutely astounding what happened in that place. It's hard for a Canadian to say this, but I mean, I'll say it. This is one of the essential events. The French Revolution was much more important than the American Revolution then, in terms of establishing what you and I would call modern society. Again, America grew bigger, and so obviously it was more important over time, but not for the first 100 years after the Revolution. America was a bunch of cowboys killing Indians. Vatarbus, and the culture, ad yemazeh, to this day. One more paragraph and we'll stop. No, we'll stop there, it's late. Okay. We'll finish this up. We'll go as far as we can go tomorrow, and then on Thursday we'll start a new matter. Okay? The Rebbe is sitting in 770 explaining all of this with this whole huge group of French guys over to the right. Right? And the Rebbe talks about Sarfas as the lowest place on earth. Meaning the fact that it was the source of this anti-God